This morning for our meditation is living wisely. And so I thought I better quickly explain before I go into the text because it may sound a little bit presumptuous, right? Like as though I can tell you how to live wisely. And so I'm not trying to tell you I know how to live wisely. I'm not being presumptuous now. I'm sharing this meditation on living wisely through the experience of King David. And so that's what I want to share this morning. Now, you all know that King David was a powerful man of war, right? And he was, how would you say? He was above everybody and below nobody. I don't know in Chinese you can say, right? 万人之上，
万人之下，
无人之下，
万人之上，
无人之下 yeah.
万人之上，无人之下。
Yeah, and so he was the king, right? But his life, you will know also in the earlier days of his life, he wasn't a very good example, right? He committed adultery, he abused his power as it were, and then he tried to commit murder. Got the woman's husband, and sent him to war so that he would die in the front line. But this psalm, I believe, was written towards the later part of David's life, at a time when he had learned to put aside all his youthful passion and lust and all that, and learn perhaps how he should relate to God. And so when he wrote these psalms, it gives us an idea, gives us an understanding of what it means to mature in the Lord and then learn how to live wisely. And so when David wrote this psalm, I think it has a lot to teach us who are Christians, because we also want to know what it means for us as believers to do things that are pleasing to God. And it is not so simple, because when you go into the psalm, David opens up so that we can understand the things that we ought to be concerned about. And so this psalm has 11 verses. Verse 1 to verse 5 actually contains the 5 things that David has determined in his heart to do, to put in place in his life. And then verse 6, as it were, is like, in his exuberance, he flows into the next verse. Actually, it's only verse 1 to verse 5, describe the things that he wants to do. Then verse 6 is, a expression of his thanksgiving now. Then from verse 7 to verse 11, David tells us 5 rewards that came to him because he chose to live wisely. And therefore then in his life we find that there are these 5 things that accrue to his life in his relationship to God. And so we want to look at the first part first this morning. First, David cries out to God. He says, "Keep me safe, O God, for in you I find refuge." David here is crying out to God for God to be his dwelling place, to be his refuge, to be the place, his shelter, the place that he can go to when he feels threatened. When his life is in danger, he said, "God, you are the one that I come to. You are my dwelling place. You are always there for me to find my security in." Now that is a surprising statement for David to make. Why? You know that David is a warring king. And so he's very adept, at the art of war, so to speak. He has commanded his army, his mighty men of David, and they have fought many battles and won. He has defeated many enemies. He has also understood what it means to be in a fortress and to defend his nation and himself and his people. And so he is the one who is accustomed to using, the fortress to defend and the chariots and the horses to attack the enemies and overpower them, right? But yet here David confesses, he cries out to God, "God, you keep me safe because in you I find refuge." Here David is saying, I'm not depending on my chariots or my fortress or my towers and my walls and all that. He says, "God, it is you the one to whom I run. In you I find refuge." And so that is a tremendous change of attitude as far as David is concerned, who is a fighting king. And so for us also, in a certain sense, we need to learn this attitude of the heart now, because instinctively, we all also know how to protect ourselves. When you travel in a car, the driver goes a bit too fast, right? Straight away you put on a safety belt, right? There's a sense of self-preservation that kicks in immediately. Or when you find an aeroplane, right, when you meet some turbulence, straight away you don't wait for the announcement to come, but you pop, you straight away buckle yourself. We have a very keen instinct to protect ourselves, to take care of ourselves. And sometimes to do that, we will work very hard, we make a lot of money so that we can put in the bank. Because we think that money in the bank will protect us when we go through rainy days or when we encounter challenges. Or sometimes we protect ourselves by, kind of connecting or networking with important people, people with influence, people with power, so that if we encounter any difficulties, we can go to them, they can help us. And so it is also something for us to learn to see that God ought to be our first refuge, not our last resort. You don't try to solve all your problems when you encounter difficulties with your money, with your people, with your devices, with your plans and all that. And when everything else don't work, then you say, God, please help me. It must not be like that. David's attitude was not like that. He says, God, keep me safe, for in you I find refuge. And so the first thing that we want to try and put in place in our lives so that we can live wisely has to do with what? Has to do with cultivating a heart attitude of dependence upon God, even for the protection of our lives. And running to Him as our first refuge, or seeing Him as our dwelling place, and not depending on our own strength, our own abilities, our own whatever that we have accumulated, in order to protect ourselves. And that involves a decision, to cultivate that heart attitude of non-dependence, but dependence on ourselves, but dependence upon God. That's the first thing that David, shows us in this psalm. Secondly, he also tells us what he says, I say to the Lord, you are my Lord. Apart from you, I have nothing, I have no good thing. Here, David, even though when you think about his accomplishments, right, David is really, he was the one who established the kingdom and set it up in the city of Jerusalem. And he was the one who began the golden age, as it were, of Israel, in terms of his military might. And so here was a king who has accomplished so much. And he is really a monarch over the whole nation. But yet here, David says that when he comes to God, what is the attitude that he comes with? He says, I say to my Lord. And this word Lord is, David is used to hearing people call him my Lord, because he's the king, right? But yet when David turns to God, he addresses God as, you are my Lord. He surrenders all his accomplishments before God. And then he says what? He says, if I don't have you, then everything that I've done, it doesn't measure up to anything good at all. And when he says there is nothing apart from you, there is no good thing in me. Actually, there are two implications here. One is saying that the best that I can perform, the best that I've ever performed, the best that I can bring, it is also nothing to you. It is not good to you. Meaning, all my righteousness, all my works are like just dirty rags in your sight, God. And then the second implication is that God, the good that you need, I will never be able to present to you. My good cannot rise up to what you term as good. And so here it is what? It is not only cultivating a heart attitude of dependence upon God, it is also nurturing a spirit of submission, a spirit of surrender, to recognize, to acknowledge that before God, nothing that we do, counts. And He ought to be the Lord over our lives. You may be a king over other people, but before God, He is our Lord. And this Lordship of Christ, I think, is something Christians ought to think a lot about now. Because most of the time, we actually exercise Lordship over our own lives now. We may call Him in our prayer, Lord, we may say that. But in terms of the degree of surrender, I think many of us as Christians have still got a long way to go. And it's also nurturing a spirit of humility, that whatever we have accomplished, whatever we bring to God, actually God has got no need at all for them. It is only in His grace and His mercy that He allows us to participate with Him with whatever gifts that we may have and to bring to Him. And so we also ought to nurture this spirit of humility. And so that's the second thing in living wisely. Now the third thing is very interesting. The third thing, after David says this to God, right, then he looks, as it were, at the other tribes that God has called to be his people. He says, those godly people who live in the land, they are the noble ones, in whom is all my delight. Now mind you, David comes from a tribe of Judah, and he knows that the tribe of Judah is the chosen tribe from whom the Messiah will come. But when David looks at what God is doing in the world, he doesn't look at Judah as the only tribe that God can use, or the only tribe that is God's people, the godly people. He looks at all the other tribes, and he says, those godly people who live in the land. He doesn't just view his own tribe and exclude all the others. He actually views all the other tribes as God's people who live in the land, and they are the noble ones, meaning they are accomplishing the things that God has set them apart to do. They are doing all things that are right with God, and they are the ones in whom David says, I take delight. Now that is an attitude towards God's people and God's kingdom and God's work in this world that we all Christians need to truly think about and learn. You know why? David is of the tribe of Judah, but he is not tribalistic when it comes to God's mission and God's people. But we as Christians, while we understand that we belong to the body of Christ, we all are a part of the body, but we are very tribalistic. We look at my ministry, and my ministry is the one that is good. My ministry is the one that is important. We look at our church. My church is the one that is doing things right. My denomination is the one that has all the right distinctives. When I look at other churches, when I look at other congregations, they say, we don't take delight that they are as important to God, they are as purposeful for God's mission in this world as we are. And so it is a whole shift of perspective that we need to also think about and then try to live wisely by putting it in place. So that when we understand that God has called many other people besides us, besides our church, besides our denomination, besides ourselves, and they are as precious to God and as important for God's plans to be fulfilled in this world as we are. And if they succeed, we ought to rejoice with them, instead of having this perspective of they, us against them, so that if they succeed, while we feel very lousy, why God is not blessing us, God is blessing them. While we feel that we are doing everything that is right, but God is not blessing us, instead God is blessing them. And if something happens to them, something bad happens to them, if a scandal breaks, we say, hallelujah. You see, they are like that. That's why these things are happening to them. And so it requires a whole change of our perspective of God's people in the world and God's work through them. And so it's developing a new perspective and understanding. And I think we all have room to kind of take, note, and then we all have room to change and to improve our perspective. Now, after David looks at God's people in the world, then he understands that actually there are two categories of people. Either you are seeking and pursuing after God, and you are God's people, the godly people who are doing his noble work. Or if you are not, then you are in the other camp. And so he looks at them and he said, those who run after other gods, their suffering will increase more and more. Then he says, I will not pour out libations of blood before such gods. Meaning he will not offer anything. He will not offer libations of, libation is something you pour in offering to other gods. But here libation of blood denotes something that is very serious, where blood is even concerned, meaning lives are being offered. And so he says, I will not do that to these such gods. He says, I will not even take their names upon my lips. Now here David is of course saying that he would not participate in any form of idolatry. He says he will not pursue after them. He will not sacrifice anything on their behalf or for them. He will not even talk about them. And so which means that conversely what David is saying, that he will only pursue after the true living God. And he would give everything of himself in sacrifice to this God. And this God is the one about whom he would always be talking about. his lips will carry only the proclamation of his name. And so that we understand was David's attitude towards God. Now for Christians also, I think we need to live wisely, but understand that we don't run after idols that are made of wood or clay and all that. We don't, right? Just now when I was coming from the bus stop, right, I realized that as you pass the two temples on the way, wow, there are so many images, right, graven images set up. The first one is like, wow, everything is there in all gigantic, huge sizes. I guess it inspires some sense of awe, when you go into a hall like that and you see all these things, there is a sense that these idols are greater than you. And so Christians, while we don't go to these places and worship these idols, I think here the implication is we must also learn to identify that there are things that we have put in our hearts above God, so that we actually don't spend our time seeking God, but we spend our time seeking after these idols. Whether it's money, whether it's fame, whether it's popularity, whether it's status, whether it's whatever. We sometimes, as long as you pursue these things more than you seek after God, then it becomes an idol in our lives. And often we are willing to sacrifice, pour libations of blood in order to achieve these things, right? Some of us, we neglect our families, we don't care, and then we work from morning to night, pursuing after money. It becomes an idol in our lives. And we are sacrificing our very lives and our families in order to achieve these things. And so we are already pouring out libations of blood before such gods. And then we talk about these things all the time. We talk about how to make money. We talk about how to achieve all these ends. And David says, I will not even put their names on my lips. Because David was able to identify the idols in his life, or in the national life of Israel, and he says, I will not. Instead, I will pursue after the living God. And that is living wisely for David, and living wisely also for us, so that we are not pursuing after these idols of our lives. And finally, after David looked at those in the world who are pursuing after the things of the world, then again he looks into his own heart, and then he expresses his the desire of his heart to God. He says, God, you alone are my portion and my cup. You make my lot secure. My boundary lines have fallen from me in pleasant places. Surely I have a delightful inheritance. Now when David describes this part, he's expressing his innermost desire. And the picture he draws here is a picture of the tribes of Israel receiving the inheritance of the land from the Lord. After they conquered or nearly conquered the Canaan, the promised land, then God promised to apportion land to the different tribes. And you read this in Joshua from chapter 13 to chapter 21. The different tribes were called, and then different portion of the land was given to them. And each time when a land is given to a certain tribe, then the Bible records, but the tribe of Levi did not receive a portion of the land, as Moses has commanded. And then every time a tribe is given a land, then again it is said, and the tribe of Levi did not receive an inheritance of the land as it was commanded by the Lord. And so when you read from chapter 13 onward, you find that at least 7-8 times it is repeated again and again that the Levites did not receive the inheritance of the land because it was commanded by Moses or it was commanded by the Lord. There's a certain sense in which the writer is trying to kind of pacify Levi. You did not receive land, but this is because God has commanded it. And so the undercurrent is that the Levites probably were not feeling very pleased with the fact that other tribes were receiving and they were receiving nothing. And so they were reminded that you are not receiving anything because God has commanded that you will not. And in fact, the Lord told them, you will not receive the land. Why? Because I will be your inheritance. Meaning, I will be all that you need. And if you have me, then you will have everything. Because why? The Levites were a special, chosen tribe to enjoy the presence of the Lord with them. They were to minister in the presence of the Lord. But apparently the Levites were not very happy, because here they were inheriting something they cannot see. They would much prefer to have land like the other tribes. And so then you find that when you come to the end of Joshua, the end of the passage, right, in Joshua 21, actually the Levites called all elders of all the other tribes together and demanded from them and tell them what? Okay, the Lord commanded, right? We don't have land, but the Lord also told you that to give us cities to live in so that we can minister in your midst. And you have to give us land so that we can bring our flock and our sheep so that they can pasture there. That is what God commanded. And so they demanded all these things as a form of consolation, as it were. And so you can understand that the Levites, even though they were specially chosen by God, yet they were not very happy with the promise that God made to them, I will be your inheritance. But here you'll notice King David, he doesn't need to be commanded by Moses or commanded by God. He's making a conscious choice